Hey, so we're live, people. Spot the deliberate error. I forgot that I got two buttons to press instead of one, and so I was just waiting for it to happen, and it didn't. So, welcome along,
Smooth
everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Yes.
Hello.
So, who have we got in? Who have we got in the house, as they say? So we've got Jeremy the Ape, Stupid Vegan World, interesting title. Canadian Vegan Forever. Hello, Ritzy 96. And Kate J and Tom Gale. About now, where have we heard that name from before, Nella and Wendy? Do you think?
No idea who that is.
We don't know, do we? Well, as you can see, we have two very special guest panelists with us. So we have Sebastian and Pattrice. Is it okay to use your names like that? Yeah. So. Okay, Patricia said, so what are we going to do today? And so it's a good question, but we've had a situation the last few weeks which is kind of relevant to this, but the wider issue for me is the fact that, the Animal Rights Show was always interested in kind of movement issues, and an ongoing movement issue is the kind of whiteness of the movement, and it often comes back at me in the sense that I often talk about the founders of the vegan social movement, and of course they were all white, and English, and so that's a kind of issue. And Sebastian, you've said that racism is rampant in the animal protection movement or the animal advocacy movement, and so I think that for the average kind of rank and file member, they will be kind of surprised, if not shocked, by such a statement. Yeah. And then for me also, part of this story is a small matter of neoliberal values, which seem to be informed by all this, in the sense that, as we know, again, this is me talking, I'm a sociologist, and it frustrates me that we don't have many sociologists in the movement talking about structural macro matters. We've got a lot of psychologists talking about individuals, and that's how it seems to be interpreted nowadays. So that's kind of my opening statement. Let's see if we can make a show out of it, people. Anybody want to bail me out?
Something that I'd just like to add as well, I think, sort of looking at this positively as well, I think going back to the title chat, I think for me, I'd love to get just have some exploration together, just as to how we can better challenge racism within the animal movement, because I think often I love to read kind of theory, and I know Pattrice and Sebastian have both written extensively on this topic, and lots of other anti-oppression content within their work. But I think for me, it's always really useful as an activist and advocate to know how to put that into practice, like in a real world, real life context, out in a community with real people. So I'd love to explore that a little if we can. And I know Pattrice recently ran with Vine Sanctuary MLK the Day Vegan Challenge, and it'd be great to hear a little bit about that, perhaps, Pattrice, if you're open to that.
Well, I was already thinking that I don't want the heat to blow onto Sebastian, for like Sebastian says racism is rampant in the movement. So Pattrice Jones also says this. And so, so direct some of that fire at me. And this is because racism is rampant everywhere. And for the most part, vegan and animal rights organizations have not included it in their remit to make sure that that their own work is actively anti-racist, or at minimum not racist, and have not taken responsibility for educating their own members, providing the kinds of educational experiences that may be necessary for a new vegan who hasn't been a politically active person, who maybe has gone vegan after watching some dreadful video, and hasn't given much thought at all in life to their white privilege, to their male privilege, straight privilege, whatever. They're just now suddenly realizing that as humans, they're experiencing, they've been participating in some cruelties that they no longer wish to participate in, and feel moved, which is a good thing, to not collude anymore in that particular kind of violence, and to try and do something about that kind of violence. But that doesn't automatically mean that now you're suddenly divested of any prejudices or stereotypes or preconceived ideas or wrongful notions that you were walking around with before you watched Meat is Murder. And so to finally answer your question, Vine Sanctuary launched the MLK Day Vegan Challenge some years ago as just a teeny tiny little intervention in this. Now, we're more than 20 years old, and we've always considered it our remit to be actively anti-racist. But some years ago, we realized that most people in the movement weren't using MLK Day, which here in the United States is a national holiday, in the way that the people who fought, and I mean fought, to make it a holiday intended. The intent for the holiday was never a day off. The intent for the holiday was a day to reflect upon, learn about anti-racist struggles, and recommit to being part of those struggles. And so we started out small. I think the first year we did it, we were just like, hey, watch this Angela Davis video, and then come onto our blog and talk about it. And ever since, every year on MLK Day, we challenge vegans. So it's a spin on the vegan challenge. We're not challenging other people to go vegan for MLK Day. Oh no, we are challenging vegans to use MLK Day to learn about past and ongoing anti-racist struggles, and then think about how they can join them. And so this year, we managed to add a new link to our website with all of the book and video recommendations that we've ever given for the challenge over the past decade or so that we've been doing it.
Well, just to respond to that, thank you for kind of mentioning that I kind of piled onto Sebastian a little bit there, because this is actually one of the biggest issues, isn't it? The fact that this is a white folks problem. And so it's that issue of how do we collectively address it and explore it and discuss it without, as it were, trying to bring people of color, as it were, as firefighters to try and get us out of the mess that we've made, if that makes sense. So I do see that issue. And it was mentioned before we came on air. I think it was, is it AFCO was saying, was it you, Nella, who was saying that there's like a move now to say, well, look, let's just stop, telling white folks.
I was reading an article by Silco, actually. It was part of the aphorism book, which I highly recommend to everyone. I think this is an amazing book. And I was thinking about an expert where she says that she's talking about all the energy that is lost and by activists who are trying to educate white people, and how this energy could be used otherwise.
So a question to Pattrice and Sebastian then, and with all the work you've done, do you feel then that it's incumbent on white people to look at the kind of catalogue of work that's already there, rather than expect more and more podcasts, more and more work? Is that where perhaps the harmony is? Like, the white people do the work from what's already exists. There's enough out there already, without expecting more people of color to put out more content, or because it often feels like I think it feels sometimes quite scary that you don't want to put work out there yourself as a white person that's not guided by, or you're not kind of hearing the perspectives of people from marginalized groups that, you don't want to speak, definitely don't want to find yourself speaking on other people's behalf, but then you don't want to put the burden onto those folks either. So it's trying to find that harmony. I think sometimes the fear of doing the wrong thing makes you do nothing at all or say nothing at all. And I think that's sometimes where there's like a real sticky spot within the movement from what I can see. I don't know what your thoughts on that might be.
I would say that both are really important, like relying on the catalog of of knowledge that's already been built, but also I don't see anything wrong. Well, of course there's nothing wrong. But I also see the value in creating new knowledge and and more content, especially online, because I'm speaking from my own experience because I am a media professional, and so I work primarily in media and especially social media spaces. And so I do see the value in in people creating more content and more knowledge, and and letting people stumble upon it organically, as well as redirecting people to the resources that already exist, or multiple voices that are already out there.
And I would add that our recommendation for this year, didn't end on January 15th. And so we are recommending this year that any animal rights activist who hasn't already done so read the collection called Anti-Racism in Animal Advocacy, which was published by Lantern Books. It also is, all of the essays are available free online via Sentient Media. You just go to the Encompass essays. You will find in that book, it's not perfect, it doesn't say everything that needs to be said, but you will encounter numerous essays by both animal advocates of color talking about their experiences in the movement and white animal advocates reporting on their own efforts to come to terms with their whiteness and figure out how to incorporate anti-racism into their animal advocacy. So we think any animal and vegan and animal advocate ought to read this book, especially since you can do it free online if you want.
Mm-hmm. I think we included the link of that in the blurb for the Facebook event and the YouTube event as well. If anyone needs to find that easily, there's a link to the resources that Vine kindly shared.
Yes,
and especially that
is in those resources. Yes.
And the link to the book. Yes, so thank you so much for those resources. Really helpful.
Yeah, Encompass is closed down now, isn't it? But the essays are still there. Is that right?
Yeah, the essays are still. The essays were published by Sentient Media and also in a book. And so even though Encompass is no more, that knowledge persists.
Yes, good. What about a very fundamental question is that some people might say the problem that we're talking about doesn't exist.
That's fun. People are very fond of saying that the problems that we're talking about don't exist. Whenever it's something that doesn't affect them personally or that they don't have any experience of. We constantly hear people saying that speciesism doesn't exist or sexism doesn't exist. We've resolved that. That's all over and done with now. Women are they're key players in the workforce, and that's done and dusted. And there's no sexism that's happening, and we can all just pat ourselves on the back and go home. And that's absolutely not true. We can say that homophobia doesn't exist. We can say that transphobia doesn't exist. And all of these things are very real and very prevalent for us right now, both in the United States and in the UK, as well as around the world. We have had over 100 bills introduced into legislation in the United States since the beginning of the year, legislating trans women's bodies. or transgender people's bodies. And like, and that's a very real thing that's happening. And still, despite all of that, you have people actually saying that this isn't a real problem. This isn't like, this isn't something worth talking about. And so like when people say that about like racism existing, like that's just people talking from their ignorance, unfortunately, because like, of the very real evidence that's out there all the time and the people like, whom it is constantly affecting. And I also wanted to just point out that like, I think it's really important that although we're having a conversation about challenging racism in the movement right now, which is rampant, not because like the vegan movement or the animal liberation movement is particularly racist, but more just as Pattrice was saying, because within our mainstream society, it's prevalent. And so therefore it can't help but like penetrate into our space as well, because we're all a part of mainstream society as well as this movement. But in addition to talking about racism, I think that it's really important to talk about the prevalence of white supremacy and like, and what that is in relation to racism, because they're related, but not the same thing. And so like, you can address or like you can recognize that like the prevalence of whiteness and normative whiteness throughout our movement is actually something that like that constrains us and constrains our thought, because like, this is the dominant strain of thought that is within our circles, within our theory, and a lot of the content and media that we consume. So we can't help but see that reflected in the ways that we interact with one another and with like, and with animals as well. So like, recognizing that and like, and like actually being present to it is as important as like being actively anti-racist too.
Yeah. You mentioned normative whiteness, and that's in the article that you shared today, which is interesting. So could you maybe define that for people?
Yeah, like when we're talking about normative whiteness, like we have to, I think it was Ruby Hamad who I was referencing when I had written an essay about it, who like, has written a brilliant book. She's also a vegan feminist herself, and like a Lebanese Australian like author. But like, she had written in her book, White Tears, Brown Scars, as well as a few articles. One of them that springs to mind is in The Guardian about like, the need to recognize whiteness as more than a skin color. We think of whiteness and we think of like,
Oh, Sebastian has frozen.
There's much more than that.
Oh, he's back.
Oh, I'm so sorry about it. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Thinking of whiteness as more than just skin color, and recognizing that like whiteness is more, it is also more ideological, and it is a way of being and a way of interacting with the world, within the world, that normalizes like the experiences of white people as the template for how all of us should be, and the way that we interact within our movements. Like one of the examples that I think of off the top of my head, because this is a conversation that I was just having this past weekend, is like the way that we talk about our activism in terms of like how people eat, which is of course the primary way in which we interact with other animals. And like within the movement, there seems to be a really, really big conversation about alt protein. And I think that that's great. I think that we should be having conversations about alt protein. I think that we should be putting money and resources, like social and financial resources, behind alt protein. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it is the prevalence of alt protein and the like hyper-valorization of meat in general that like, that is a product itself of like of whiteness and white supremacy. Because over the past like 150 years, like, this is like white supremacy has driven our overconsumption of meat in a lot of ways. And what has that done to other, say, vegan activists or like, people of color within vegan spaces who produce food content in particular? Like we see like within my news feeds on social media, I see a lot of people of color talking about how they struggle to find an audience for the recipes that they produce because they are recipes that are part of their cultural heritage. And their cultural heritages have been erased. And so like when we're talking about like, food, like we have this like, this hypervalorization of meat over here and this complete invisibility, like, that covers like other sources of food or like other sources of protein that like, that indigenous people and like people of color throughout the diaspora have been consuming for centuries. And that's a problem. That's a problem because we have allowed white thought and the normalization of white food as the template for how we should be eating to be like, the dominant form of food consumption or food media content consumption that we're looking at. And not allowing that to be the focus would be super great. That would be super great.
And I want to toss in there, like, because I think the idea of the valorization of meat as a function of white supremacy might not be that clear to many people, but just imagine yourself an image of a beef eater, which you'll be able to do easily if you're in the UK or anywhere where beef eaters gin is sold. Now, why were they called beef eaters? They were called beef eaters because they were a colonial army who were fighting South Asians who were predominantly vegetarian. And the idea was that as beef eaters, they were superior, stronger, smarter, etc., and that this was enabled by and reflected by their beef eating. And that's just one example. And then I would also just toss in, of course, the valorization of meat is really super tied to masculinity. So we can see another way that it's all sort of linked together. And then I also can't help but think that this idea of alternative proteins as a technological fix that's going to solve our problems does reflect a way of thinking about the world that people who study whiteness would identify as associated with whiteness. The idea that you can just sort of abstract out this one thing and then come up with a technological fix for it, and that you don't have to think about the social or economic or historical or ecological factors that are also involved in the problem, that you can just pick this one little thing and find a technological fix for it. And so in our movement, alt meat has become that mythical technological fix. And I'm with Sebastian in that, of course, that's an important part of the puzzle, but it's actually just one part of the puzzle, and not even a particularly important one as far as I'm concerned. But if we focus all of our resources on this one piece of the puzzle, then what aren't we working on that we could also be working on? That's super problematic. And that's a really concrete way that, in my mind, that whiteness can skew a movement without ever even saying anything about race.
Mm-hmm.
I think one example of that was in your article, Sebastian, where you were talking about Nick Cooney's book. And because of his lack of understanding of people of color and their history, he made a distorted point about the eating of chickens. Do you remember that in the article? So I think that's a related issue, isn't it? That if we don't have a fuller understanding of things, then even the points we want to make are going to be mistaken and wrong.
Absolutely. And just to elaborate on what Roger is talking about, I had written an essay that will be, as well as Patrice, by the way, both of us have written essays that are featured in the forthcoming book, The Good It Promises, The Harm It Does, collection of essays that are critical on effective altruism. And hopefully we can put a link to that book in the show notes. But in particular, what Roger's referring to was an example that I was talking about, in which Nick Cooney, who is a very respected activist, had written in his book, Veganomics, which I think is more of an homage to Freakonomics, which was a 2010s book that actually talked about one of the many of the quirks of statistical analyses and in economics. He had cited the consumption of chickens in particular. In a couple of places in his book, but in this particular chapter that I was talking about, like he was talking about like how black people are the primary consumers of chickens, in at least in the United States. I don't remember if he just said in general or if he said in the USA, but I'm pretty sure it was just the USA. And how like chickens are some of the most exploited animals, and so talking about like a focus on chickens. Insofar as like choosing a particular species who needs our attention or who is underserved in particular, like, you know, it would behoove us to target African Americans, or as I say, Black people, as like, you know, as people that we would prioritize in our activism in order to like, you know, quote convince us to like stop eating quite so much chicken. There are many problems with the like analysis that like, you know, that I think of or that come to mind. But what really like stuck out to me in particular in that example is the fact that like, you know, in writing this passage, this very simple passage, any reader who like, you know, who engages with this work is automatically going to end up looking at a Black person as a potential target for convincing them to stop eating chicken without actually engaging with any of the social, economic, or historical reasons why a Black person would be eating chicken in the United States. And all of that is actually, once again, rooted in racism and in white supremacy. Because as it turns out, and this has been like, you know, noted by several scholars, like I think the one that I referenced in my work was Psyche Forson. Oh my God, I'm going to ruin her name. And so I'm going to have to put it myself in the show notes later on. But like, you know, in particular, like, you know, number one, like, you know, chickens weren't actually considered real sources of meat during the times of slavery. And so in the 1700s, slave owners actually relegated chickens to Black and brown people. And like, they weren't actually even counted among like, you know, the livestock that were actually kept, not like, you know, quantified in real numbers anyway. And so therefore that contributed to Black people consuming chicken. Also in the 1800s, Black women in particular actually had used chicken as a source of their economic like well-being, because frying chicken and selling it was one of the primary ways that Black women were actually able to acquire and build wealth. And so there are all of these cultural traditions that are built around chickens in particular that are embedded in Black history. And then you get into the 1900s, and like, you know, with the invention of film, you have that horrible, like racial propaganda film, Birth of a Nation, which had actually depicted Black people as eating fried chicken, and fear mongering around like Black people who were eating fried chicken, which is a food this is notoriously eaten with your hands and makes a lot of mess, running our white people's cities. And so like, you know, there are all of these cultural and historical touchstones that lead to this one iconic moment in the 21st century where we are talking about Black people eating chickens, and like, you know, and placing responsibility for the abuse of chickens on Black and brown people, or specifically Black people. And so all of the abuse on chickens is our responsibility, rather than locating that blame and locating that focus on the history of white supremacy in the United States that has led to this moment, and how white people can actually take control of fixing that problem rather than putting a target on Black people's backs.
Wow.
I mean,
thank you for that.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that the owners of Tyson and Purdue and all of the corporations that make their profits through the killing and exploitation of chickens are white.
Probably, I'm guessing.
But what I noticed about this passage that you quoted in Nick's book, which I had not read because I had not read at the time of publication because I did not subject my brain to anything stated by that. The two things that sort of jumped out at me was, one, you know, of course, while he's spinning all of these numbers that reflect and amplify anti-Black stereotypes, He's conveniently neglecting to mention that in the United States, Black people are more likely than white people to be vegan, about twice as likely. That's conveniently left out. And the other thing that really struck me was that this isn't just a clumsy paragraph. This is overtly racist. And I'm not so much concerned about Nick Cooney as I am all the vegans who read that book. And somehow I managed to never know that passage was there because nobody wrote anything objecting to it. Nobody said anything objected to it. Nobody in any of the reviews of this book felt compelled to say, wait a minute, what's all this stuff he's saying about Black people in this book?
Yeah,
so
the language is...
What that tells me is that we really, if I didn't know already, that there's a real problem.
What's also really funny is that like this actually could have been avoided. It never had to make its way into the book if we actually once again had a more inclusive movement that like, you know, where like someone on another level, perhaps a copy editor, I don't know, I'm not advertising myself, I'm available. Would be able to like, you know, like at some level during the publication process, like, you know, like actually having like a sensitivity reading would have like a book like this would have benefited from it. And so, like, you know, therefore, like, you know, like we would like this was an institutional failure. And this is what I think gets at the point that Pattrice had made and the point that Roger had made. And like, you know, talking about like the individualization of like, you know, of responsibility or the over-reliance on like consumers as the end users. Like that approach to veganism, while it is very welcome, it is a very one-dimensional approach. And looking at the structural, like Roger said, use that word, that the structural problems that we have within our movement is also important. It is of equal importance because if we like, you know, like on an institutional level, like that actually would never have made it into a book like this and to be consumed by so many people who actually want to do good work and are reading something like this uncritically. And so yeah, like this is a reflection of how we need to do better about like including people of various backgrounds and not just having a one day. And this isn't like, you know, a slight on the publishers. This is not like, you know, this isn't like a slight on any one individual person. Like, you know, these aren't personal attacks, but just examples of how we can actually do better.
I have a question about inclusivity and the movement, because I'm under the impression that in this movement, we think that we are inclusive, and obviously we aren't, because I'm thinking after all this theory that has been written, and almost everyone has easy access to it by now, we still do not engage with the theory. We don't engage with the art. We don't engage with the recipes written by Black and brown people. And our inclusivity stops to the point that we may say for an event that everyone is welcome, and we feel that everyone is welcome. But are they really welcome when we don't engage with what they have written? And is this the core of the problem in the movement, or I'm looking to it in a very superficial way? Because
no, I don't think it's superficial.
I'm still thinking that people are drawing parallels in a way. They're using one kind of oppression to push an agenda, no matter how good this agenda may be, like animal liberation, of course, it's my agenda too. But after all this theory written about why we should not draw simplistic parallels and use one oppression to as an example for another, we are doing it every day. I mean, I see in social media people doing it every day, and probably I've done it in the past. But all this knowledge is out there right now. It's not hidden. You don't have to do some, I don't know, difficult research to find it. It's everywhere, and it's like as if we are not listening to what other people say.
Listen, this just occurred to me. So so let's imagine somebody who becomes a vegan. A vegan. I always just use it as adjective to describe myself. I'm never saying I'm a vegan. But who becomes vegan, and actually does identify, I am a vegan, on the basis of encountering any of the many super effective ways that are out there now that awaken people to the horrific suffering of non-human animals in the food system, or who are awakened to the injustice of it through some sort of rational argumentation, and so they go vegan because they can't tolerate the feeling of being complicit in this, right? And so they have to do something, right? And so they go vegan, and they feel good about that. And then they start promoting veganism, and they feel good about that. And the vegan movement tells them, you're a hero for being vegan. So now, not only do they not feel bad, they feel actively virtuous, which is a drug. And I noticed that, at least for some, even really speciesism isn't all that questioned, huh? Like, remember earlier in the conversation when Christopher was distinguishing between racism and white supremacy? Well, there's also speciesism and human supremacy. And sometimes when you're seeing for things produced by really proud vegans, there's still a lot of human supremacy in there, right? The animals are the animals. Anytime somebody says the animals, right away I'm like, oh, okay, we haven't gone that far in contesting our human supremacy yet, have we? When animals are lumped as the animals, but I'll just I don't know. There's a patronizing way. They'll be calling adult animals babies, these innocent babies. And yes, the chickens killed by the chicken industry are innocent babies, but the other industries often aren't. And we're not these aren't babies. These are adults. These are adult captives who are fighting for their own liberation. And often, I don't know, there's a way that that some vegans are still centering themselves. They're the hero of the story, not a non-human animals, right? Okay, and so like, if you're someone who's in that position, then even though you have shown yourself to be someone who's capable of making change when confronted with a harsh reality and really wanting to do good, you're also someone who clearly is, you're uncomfortable with being told that you're not perfect, or that how am I trying to say this? What I'm trying to say is that if you're feeling like, oh, I'm the hero for the animals, and then someone else is saying, oh yeah, but listen, as a white person, you're not the hero. As a white person, actually, you're still experiencing, you're still, whether you're actively racist or not, you're still reaping the rewards of an unjust system that hurts others. That can be really, that could be, that's hard. So I think that's one of the sources of resistance. And I was thinking of another source of resistance, but I've talked too long.
No, never. I could always go and listen to Patrice forever. But do you think this ties in then with the other problem that seems to be quite prevalent, in that not only do people deny that racism goes on within the movement, but they also say, even if it is going on, it's not our problem. The animals, as Patrice just referred to, need their own movement, and therefore we should not be dealing with human issues within our movement. This is about the animals, and therefore this is irrelevant and should be dealt with separately. Does that tie in with what you were just saying, Patrice?
Yes, because did they ask any animals before making this proclamation on their behalf? Because my sense is that different animals would feel really differently about it. Like cows, they don't like anybody to get hurt. And chickens or dinosaurs, like I don't think they give a fuck. I'm allowed to say that. But yeah, I mean, because notice there's this way of like making decisions on behalf. They say animals need their own movement. Well, and yes, led by animals, in which the humans are seeing themselves as allies and approaching the question not with heroic hubris, but with modesty and a real question of, whoa, okay, I went for all these years thinking that this was okay. And then my eyes were open to it. Oh, and so many vegans tell me it's really hard to remember themselves before the shift, right? Yeah, so now I've lost my train of thought again. But yes, instead of saying, okay, look, I thought this for so long, I thought it was okay. And then my eyes were open and I realized it's not okay. Woo. Okay, so then I go on and ask, what else have I been walking around thinking that's not okay? What other ways have I been participating in violence and not even realizing it? So there's this way of just like asking that one question, choosing veganism as your solution, and then sealing yourself off from the rest of it, right? And then you identify so strongly with animals that you're not able to understand. Yes, of course. Ain't nobody asking a hen who is locked up in a battery cage to care about racism. But you are not that hen. You are a human among other humans who have a particular position among other humans. And that position, for most of us, involves some level of privilege and some level of the opposite. And it's always messy to come with it.
On that, Patrice, I just want to push back a little bit in the sense that we get a lot of sentences starting with, the animals don't care if, you know, if you're a feminist or if you're a men's rights activist or if you're a racist or if you're a fascist, they just want to be liberated and all that. But the movement should be interested in those things. And that points to the fact that it's actually not the other animals' movement. I mean, it's a human-run movement full of humans, and the other animals are the subject of our movement. And I understand the thing about the allyship point. I understand that. But, you know, to actually, you know, going back to what Wendy said, to actually kind of almost like say, well, you know, it's their movement. It's not, it's our movement. And therefore, issues like sexism and racism are important within a social movement context. I always bring things to a social movement context. And in that sense, and also the structural thing that Sebastian mentioned that I tend to talk about, I mean, this is an interesting point, because it seems to me that the structure of the movement is a major problem as well, in the sense that we do have this kind of corporatized mentality in the movement. And I think that's counter-revolutionary, personally, from a kind of almost like social anarchist kind of sense, because it's kind of going back to what you were saying, Patrice. It's kind of, oh, you get told you're a hero, and then that hero then gets an audience. Well, that's not what we want. We want everybody to be activists, rather than picking out certain people to be the special ones who are viewed on YouTube all the time. Aren't they great? We want everybody to be great in that sense, right? Now, I don't know whether the corporatization of a social movement is a white thing or not, just to tie a few things. I mean, Sebastian, is that too much of a stretch?
No.
Ah, good.
Categorically, no.
Well, yeah, because I've always, because I mean, I think the funding structure of this movement is a major problem to its. This is the reason why it's moderating all the time, to the extent now that we've got. I mean, talking about racism, it's not that long ago that a vegan group wanted to give $1 million to Donald Trump. Right now, and myself and Ronnie Lee have just kind of tried to analyze the fact that the same group, although a different name, wants to give the same amount of money to the richest politician in Britain, who is a neoliberal shooter. He goes shooting, supports grouse shooting, and all the rest of it. And it's almost as though we were thinking back to the. Well, I said, I'd love to have been a fly on the wall in the meeting where that came up, because it just blows my mind that anybody in the vegan movement, which stands for justice, can come up with such a weird idea. And the only way I can think about it is that we've got this corporatized system, which is kind of almost like making us deflecting us from the stuff which is, you know, the grassroots. Really, that's the core of our movement, and yet we've got this kind of nonsense that's going on all over the place.
Look, I think that nonsense, that particular nonsense is just down to PETA setting the stage however many decades ago with the idea that no publicity is bad publicity, and any stunt you can pull that will get people writing about veganism in any way is a good thing.
Yeah.
And so I feel fairly certain that the people who made that particular decision in terms of those particular challenges were thinking along those lines.
Yeah, I agree. There's no such thing as bad publicity, which is not true. I mean, I've been a press officer for a radical group, and sometimes it's difficult to get good publicity because there's so much shit being thrown at you that, you know, and eventually it starts to stick. So there is such a thing as bad publicity. And yeah, you're right. I mean, this is really a grotesque kind of publicity stunt, but, you know, totally outside of the values of veganism, it seems to me. So it's just a bit bizarre. I did notice this about 20 minutes ago from Jeremy. And because, again, this kind of, I don't know whether this is a challenge to us or an opportunity to us to talk about that. So it seems that our challenge is to first identify racism, then decide when to respond to it. Perhaps some of the panel have examples of doing this and how it went, and that would help others. Is that worth having as a little exercise?
I think so.
I wonder if we might talk about recent
Well,
events.
yeah, I was going to say, but Sebastian, I mean, presumably you've encountered this much more. Well, maybe I don't know. What do you think?
If I were to say, like, there are dozens of examples that I could think of off of the top of my head. Yeah, so according to Jeremy's comment, which I'm reading on the screen right now, so it seems our challenge is to first identify racism and then decide how/when to respond to it. Perhaps some of the panel have examples of doing this and how it went that would help others. So yeah, like, so absolutely, we can identify instances of racism as they occur. Like, you know, like we have several examples from the book that, like, you know, that we were just talking about. Like, you know, examples from, like, you know, from PETA, from, like, you know, vegan campaigning, that, like, you know, that offers like absurd amounts of money to, like, you know, wealthy people who are in some ways objectively terrible. Like, you know, like, these are examples of, like, you know, of I would say of racism. And like, and if we're confused about, like, you know, how and why those are examples of racism, we can have that discussion as well. But for me personally, like, you know, like, I think that, like, let me just use an example that happened to me in this past week. All right. So, like, you know, like, I had like there was a news story that was going around in the United States, where like over 50 children were found in a Midwest slaughterhouse, who, like, you know, were working overnight in slaughterhouses, like, you know, and possibly victims of child trafficking. And so this news story broke, I think, sometime in the past 7 days. And, like, you know, and people had tagged me in it. Many people had tagged me in it. And so this is what I would call an example of, like, you know, of normatively white thought. Like, you know, like, this is a story about, like, you know, about children who are working in slaughterhouses. And this is so wrong because the kids are working in slaughterhouses. And doesn't that make you feel bad? And doesn't that make you want to go vegan? And to me, that's a great big yikes. Because, like, you know, to me, when I read the story, like, my immediate thought is not, how can I exploit this story or weaponize this story to make people go vegan? To me, my first thought is, oh my God, child labor is wrong and it's bad because child labor is bad, not because children are laboring in a slaughterhouse. And so on my social media, I am actually explaining how weaponizing children or a story about child labor in particular is not something that I would want to be a part of, because that's not how I would want my vegan advocacy to go. Also, I don't actually think that it's that effective. On top of everything else, like, you know, whether or not, like, you know, it's good or bad, like, at the bottom line is, like, how effective is it? Does this actually work? And I would say the answer to that is categorically no. So yeah, like, you're number one, back to square one. But in me actually talking about this, there was a lot, and I mean a lot, of, like, racial antagonism and pushback that I had gotten in the comments, and, like, in the tone policing of, like, the way that I wanted to show up, or that I chose to show up for my veganism, by saying, like, this is not, please don't tag me in this. If that is what you want to do and you want to, like, you know, partake in activism of this style, that's not the type of work that I do. Like, that's not my energy. And, like, you know, and the racial abuse, and in many ways, sometimes coded racial abuse, which, like, there's a layer of plausible deniability, because every time, like, you open up your mouth, you don't have to say, hey, that Black person over there, in order for it to be racial. The way that you show up can and often is racial. That is, like, that, to me, that's our example of racism. How do you show up? How do you respond to that? Like, you know, like, when do you respond to that? I would say respond to it in the moment. I would say that, like, you know, hey, this is what this person is saying. This is why they're saying it. And this is important. And guess what? It actually lands a lot differently when it's coming from a white person than when it's coming from a Black person. That is how I want people to show up for me. And guess what else? We also see, or let me say, other Black and brown people also see, when you do that, that legitimizes our activism. That gives us credibility. When we actually show up and challenge racial assumptions, racial abuse, racial antagonism, when we challenge normative whiteness in the moment, that gives credibility to our activism, because it reveals that you actually care about this issue. Like, you know, and I don't want, like, you know, my activism to be, like, contingent on, like, how can I use or weaponize other people's oppression. I don't want my activism to be, like, you know, to be grounded in, or foundation, like, you know, the foundation of it being laid by, like, you know, how do I use child labor? How do I use Jewish people? How do I use another group? Showing up for that group and showing up authentically actually legitimizes your work. And it gives you credibility, authenticity in that space. It allows people to listen to you when you are actually talking about veganism. So that's like, that is an example of how to handle interactions, at least in an online space. But do this with your organizations as well. When your organizations are launching campaigns that you think are like, actively or passively, like, participating in or complicit in the oppression of other people, or like, or creating like circumstances that are making other people's lives harder, I can't imagine like, a campaign that like, where you're offering to give $1 million to someone who probably actually doesn't care about your $1 million or animals either. Like, like offering them money to go vegan while millions of trans people, like gay people, lesbians, like Black people, immigrants, like Jewish people are sitting there and looking at that. Like you can say, oh, this is effective. But at the same time, how is it not effective? Who are you actively hurting? Who's looking at that and saying, like, absolutely not. I could not care less about veganism right now because this is how it has been portrayed. This is how you've chosen to utilize your platform and your financial resources. That's what you've chosen to do. And so, yeah, like, challenge your organizations when they engage in those types of harmful campaigns. Let's just say, for example, Donald Trump did decide to take your $1 million and he ate plant-based for a month. Woohoo, by the way, because I doubt that it would stick. I don't know because you can't prove a counterfactual. But let's just say, for example, he did that and you're going to give $1 million to an organization or a charity of his choice. What charity do you think that he's going to choose? And who do you think would actually benefit from that money? The January 6th insurrectionists, perhaps? Like, I don't know. But this is a material harm that would actually be an outcome of that. You just don't know. All of the consequences of this sensationalized campaign are actually going to create material harms for Black and brown people and any type of minoritized person later on down the line, if not in the moment. That's a reality that we have to face and talk about, like, it realistically.
Here.
Well,
I'm done with that.
Yeah. I mean that's good. And I mean, one of the weird things about this British example that is running now is the fact that we've got nurses queuing up at food stations. And I made the point about, well, there's no thought about alliance politics here, because you're going to get, progressive movements who are working to alleviate poverty at the time of austerity in Britain. And this is what the vegans do. And again, talk about, kind of burning bridges here. And there's bound to be a racial element to that as well, because we do know that in times of recession, that people of color are overly impacted by things like, redundancy and all the rest of it, plus the fact there's a lot of people of color in the British health service, and they're being screwed by this government. This vegan group is trying to give $1 million to a charity of his choice, by the way. So it could be the British Heart Foundation. Yeah. So it could go to vivisection. It's almost as though it's the only thing that was a consideration is what Pattrice said, which was, oh, we'll get some publicity, and nothing else was even thought about. Seemed to me really weird.
Yeah, it seems like there's a real.
Understand that it's designed to maintain the status quo, which a lot of our activism is designed to do. We just want to somehow remove animals from it, which I don't think is possible.
Yeah, and it just seems like there's not a lot of thought that goes into some of the campaigns or strategies or tactics that actually completely embody the values of justice and anti-oppression as a complete picture. It seems that people just take little strands of what they relate to or what they think is a good piece of marketing or shock tactics or whatever it might be, but it's all done in kind of very much single issue isolation without looking at the bigger picture of actually we are a justice movement against all oppression, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of thought that goes into that with a lot of these campaigns or organizations and things like that. So I think it's even more shocking when you hear these kind of things from vegans, because you feel like we ought to be aware that we're in a justice movement, and yet it seems like many people are not. it just seems to just pass them by somehow. And yeah, I find it quite depressing at times, to be fair.
But Wendy, on that note, there isn't that the very reason why we've now got the animals only strand of animal advocacy and veganism? Because they don't like the justice for all thing. They don't like that, and they don't like the kind of left-leaning politics that implies. And so this is why they're rejecting. You know, I mean, back in 1945, when Donald Watson said that veganism was the opposition to the exploitation of sentient life, they won't swing with it anymore because they want it. They want to narrow it down. So it's like a form of reducitarianism in our own movement, trying to narrow the scope of veganism. And so the idea of the focus being our relationship with other animals, they want to make that the scope of the whole thing, because they don't want anything on the outside of that, because their own politics.
There is this approach, but there is also another part of the movement that wants alliance politics, but wants it because they want something in return. Like, I'll show up to your thing, but you'll show up to mine. And so, I feel that something lost there, because even if oppressions were not connected, which they are, we should be there every time, because all oppressions are bad. I mean, even if when we are not affected directly, we should be there, not because we expect some other group to be an ally to our cause, but because oppression is a bad thing whenever, to whomever it happens.
I think you get the reverse of that as well, don't you, Nella, where people say, well, I showed up to that protest, but none of those people are vegan, so therefore why should I show up to the Black Lives Matter protest when actually, you know, none of those people are vegan or standing in solidarity with veganism? And you get all of that backlash as well, don't you? I'm not going to stand in solidarity because it's not coming back the other way. You get that real resistance to that as well.
That's what I meant. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Because something I hear a lot lately, at least here.
Patrice, did you have thoughts?
Why are you asking me that?
Because you looked like you had thoughts, Patrice.
I always have thoughts.
Please share.
I mean, I was feeling sad. But at the same time, I was feeling sad because we have to be having this conversation. I was feeling sad about the persistence of racism, but at the same time, I was feeling like, okay, well, look, here's these three people from the animal rights show who, you know, really want to figure it out. So then I was feeling good about that. But then I was feeling like, oh man, humans. Like, oh, can we figure anything out? Like, and oh man, I need to continue to try and learn what I can learn from other animals and the larger than human world that might help me think a little differently. So those are the feelings that were probably flashing across my face at that moment.
And also that chickens don't give a fuck.
Here at the sanctuary, we always say that we are so grateful that the chickens are not the size of the cows. Because if they were, we would be murdered. Yeah.
Well, some non-vegans make that claim, don't they? That if they could, they do it. They do too. You know, one of the things that, I mean, Wendy and Nella will know this. One of the things I really dislike are those memes when they show other animals as the vivisector or the butcher. And I'd like to think that other animals would be better than us, and so they wouldn't violate our rights as readily as we violate theirs. But maybe I'm wrong, given what you just said there.
Well, look, I mean, most animals leave other animals, except for those who are, you know, obligate predators. And even obligate predators, they don't mess with anybody except like who they need to be dinner or feed their kid tonight. So yeah, most animals would leave us alone. I mean, you got to imagine that with farmed animals and other animals who we've been exploiting, there's probably some feelings about that. So who knows? But I agree with you about the cartoons. I like to just try and imagine what the world looks like from other points of view.
You know,
but understanding that I can only guess.
Yeah. I mean, we are in that interesting social movement situation that the subject of our social movement can't tell us that we're messing up or that we're doing okay. We have to try and work that out ourselves, I suppose, which is thing. Going back to what you just said, Patrice, I remember being in a police cell once with this guy who ended up being a bit of a careerist in the movement, but he was an activist at the time. And he said, do you think it's possible that cows are alien beings, but they're the ultimate pacifists, and so they won't fight back, even though they could? Because I mean, cows do actually kill quite a few farmers, but usually just by kind of leaning on them, and it's a kind of almost like a group solidarity kind of movement.
No, there's actual killings, and there's actual, like one of the cows here, Norma, came here the second time. After the second time, she sent a dairy worker to the hospital for stitches, using her horns to protect her calf from being taken away from her. We were super lucky. She was lucky in that instance that the worker who had been sent to the hospital asked the owner of the dairy to please not send her to be killed, and to send her to a sanctuary instead, because, quote, she was only being a good mother. And so she and her daughter, Nina, are here. And the thing about Norma is that while she absolutely could kill any of us if she wanted to, she's actually among the more, like, she's a gentle soul. And so it's her story is, I mean, inspiring in that she fought back, but also just heartbreaking. And yet one more example, and we see it among humans too, of, when someone is pushed to the brink, what they will do, because she's a gentle soul who only engaged in violence in order to protect her child.
Seems reasonable.
I think a lot of women who are incarcerated are often for murder are usually women who've been abused and violated for so long that they've been pushed to the edge. And I think a lot of prisons are full of women like that who broke. But I just wanted to ask Patrice, actually. Patrice, normally when you give a talk or do go to an event or something like that, you usually have someone in mind from the sanctuary, someone, a resident, or sometimes a place at the sanctuary. And I wondered if you had anyone in mind today before you started the show. Who did you come along with?
Be gentle on us, Patrice.
I mean, the person at the sanctuary who I most often think about when I'm trying to figure out humans is another self-liberated cow. Her name is Jan. We didn't come up with that. She came to us. Her original rescuer came up with that name, and she had lived at a small-scale dairy farm, not dairy. I'm sorry, beef farm, where she was used to breed, cows who would then be raised and killed. And so evidently at one point she was just like, nah, that's enough. And so she jumped the beef farm fence pregnant and gave birth in the woods to her son Justin. And then and then she somehow led them through the forest to some person who she accurately perceived as safe. Who then conveyed her to Farm Sanctuary, where she was a little too wild to stay at a place where they often have visitors trooping through, because I'm telling you, she would charge you if you even looked at her calf. And so they came here to Vine, where they could enjoy the freedom of the back pasture and where humans are we count everybody twice a day, make sure everybody's got food and water, but they conduct their own affairs, and visitors are very rarely there. And so I often, when I'm trying to figure things out about humans, I ask myself, okay, well, one, what does Jan know about humans that humans don't know about themselves? What does Jan know about humans? And then I also will just ask myself, okay, how would I explain this to Jan? And if I did, what would she think about it, right? And most of the time, it's really hard to try and figure out how to sensibly describe something that seems really normal to humans, like property. And usually I conclude that she probably would think it was dangerous nonsense. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Jan's an anarchist, but I tell you one thing that Jan might know is what a real name is. Do you ever think somebody who kind of like lives on a sanctuary? Do you ever wonder about the real names of the other animals, not the ones given to them, stroke imposed on them by humans? Do you think
I think about that all the time. Not all the time, but I mean, just like in what ways because our not just names, but right, our very thinking is patterned by words, and we find it really hard to think without them. And non-human animals are, for the most part, not using words as the basis of not only not the basis of their cognition, but not the basis of their communication either. They're not using words to talk, and they're not using words to think. And so I do really try to the cows have such amazingly peaceful social structures among themselves with complex roles, and the cows in the back pasture all get along, and they resolve conflicts, and I sometimes try to imagine, well, how is this how are they conceptualizing this in their heads that are thinking, that I think about that. But on the name tips, I do know my name in one other animal's language, if this is interesting.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That's very interesting.
Okay, well, one person who's almost always in my mind when I'm having calls like this, and I almost mentioned along with Jan, is a parrot called Wiley, who lives downstairs, and her story is too long to tell. But when I first moved into this house, she lived in this house before I did. We already knew each other, and we had some sound effects that we make. She loves music of all kinds. I can share a playlist if you like of her favorites. Her pal Harvey, who's an African, she's an African gray. Harvey is a Amazonian. He likes old school rap. So I would whistle a particular tune often to her. And it's also a tune that I would use to whistle to let a particular cat know that the dinner time. And so and the first few bars of this that I whistle are so anyway, I would whistle this a lot, and then she learned part of the song, and so she would whistle it too. She's very, very smart. She knows so many words. Oh, she tricks people all the time. She can talk in different people's voices. She's a staff member one time. I was away, and the staff member heard my voice calling her. But when she came in the house, she heard laughing from the parrot room. So I mean, Wiley is way smarter than us. I am really because she knows way more of our language than we do. But in any case, one day I was talking to her, and she knows the names of all the cats and dogs, and so she was talking to Trixie, who she calls Tricky, and then there's Brookie, and there's Lucky, and then there's Harvey. And so one day I said to her, Wiley, I know Lucky, and you know Tricky, and you know Harvey, and you know Brookie, but what do you call me? And she paused, and then she said, that tune. So that's my name.
I thought you were going to say Joan. I thought you were going to say Jonesy, but
I love that. I love that she's got a name for you. That's brilliant.
Mm-hmm. And it's a sound
symbol. She'd call me Yatesy, wouldn't she? Yatesy. I used to get that at school, Yatesy.
Well, I'll call you Yatesy. I'm sure she
I think I used to call you Yatesy at one bit, didn't I? No, I just call you Doc most of the time. For some reason, Doc.
When you're not swearing at me.
She came up with it, right?
Yeah.
Of course she didn't know my name because I never used my name. And actually she does. She knows how to call Patrice because she's tricked me doing that. But I don't think that's how she thinks. I think the sound is, yeah.
So does she actually call you over then with that? Will she get you to come over?
She does. Yes, she has many ways of getting my attention. So if it's late and I haven't yet turned off their light, she will, done the things for bedtime. She'll start saying, first she'll start yawning really loudly and ostentatiously. Like she'll go, ah, oh, which is not how parrots yawn, right? That's just what humans do when we're sleepy. So first she makes really ostentatious yawning noises. And then if I still haven't done it, then she'll start saying the things that I say when I say goodnight to them all. So she'll say, good night, Harvey. Good night, Wiley. Like that, to get me to come in. And to call you to her, sometimes she'll say, come here, but you never should, because that means she's going to bite you. and then possibly after biting you say, sorry.
Oh, brilliant. I love Patrice's stories. Patrice, I wonder if you might one day write a book or make some kind of story recording of all the stories you have about all the other animals that you've encountered at the sanctuary, because they always mesmerize me. The duck one particularly is one of my all-time favorites, but yeah, there's some brilliant ones. I wonder if you might collate them together one day. Yeah.
You could do an audio book. Well, you could be on as part of your podcast. So, Sebastian, I guess we ought to round this up. Do you think, given the massive remit that we set for ourselves, do you think we might have got anywhere today, or what?
Oh, absolutely not. No, we'll start all over. No, I do think that we've gotten somewhere. Like, this is the thing, like, like, this is an ongoing project, right? Like, this isn't something that, like, can be, like, we haven't solved racism in an episode. And we're not gonna, like, so I think that, like, we just revisit the conversation as often as possible and not let it die. That's what's important. And so yeah, like, to that end, I do think that we have gotten somewhere, and we will continue to get somewhere.
So for people who want to know more about your work, they can find you on social media. They can also find your site by just typing your name, full name.
That's right.
And you have resources also there.
Yes.
And there is a bunch of YouTube videos with your speeches.
Bunch of YouTube videos, yes. Regrettably, much to my chagrin, they exist.
Oh, they do? Why? Why regrettably?
Oh my God, it's just like, I never Google myself. I never look for videos. I know that they're out there and other people have them. I have no idea. Like, sometimes people drag things up that I've said, like, as early as 2016. I don't remember what I said in 2016. I'm sure it was brilliant. Or conversely, I'm sure that I disagree with myself. Who knows?
You never Googled yourself. Yeah, right.
For what's worth, I found these videos very helpful. Very helpful. And you have no, I'm just sincere, I'm not kind. You have this way to explain things and to explain a theory that at the beginning may seem difficult, complicated, far-fetched to my mind, and at the end of your talk it's clear. So I think this is amazing.
Thank you. Can't react.
Well, I'll tell you one issue that surprised me, because I'd never thought of it before, and again, this is quite telling, I guess, is the fact that I think it was the Vevolution talk you gave, you talked about Colonel Sanders and that image. I didn't know. The slave owner.
Yeah, when you look up like, again, talking about chickens, right? Like, you gotta love chickens. It's a common motif. But, like, yeah, like the iconography that we have in the United States, as Patrice was talking about, like, beef eaters and, like, and the history of certain things. Like, Colonel Sanders is like of KFC, because no one actually says Colonel Sanders anymore. But you see this iconic image of, like, the guy who's wearing, like, the string bow tie, if you will. But when you look at the original Colonel Sanders and the Colonel Sanders that we'd had all the way up until, I believe, the 1990s, if not the early 2000s, the full image of him is of a man that was fond of wearing the outfit of a 19th century, like, plantation owner. Like, that's what Colonel Sanders actually looks like. By the way, there was a real Colonel Sanders. That's a real person. Like, so this is how he walked around when he wasn't frying chicken. And, like, and this is a part of, like, Americana, if you will. And this is a part of the imagery and the cultural iconography that we built around chicken, the cultural mythology that we build around chicken, just like the cultural mythology that we build around the, quote, cowboy and where he comes from and what he represents in American culture, in beef eating culture, and who the American cowboy is and what he's tied to and what the actual job is. So yeah, like, all of these things, again, so much of the, like, cultural consumption of meat is wrapped up in the cultural consumption of white supremacy in the US, in the UK, throughout much of Western Europe. And, like, this is what we're looking at, and this is what we're talking about when we're talking about, like, the how do we reckon with our consumption of other animals, within and outside of the animal rights movement in the 21st century. And omitting that, I think, is a grave error, and it's to our detriment collectively.
That talk in particular, I think, was really, really helpful. It was we could maybe share that as well under here, couldn't we? The Sebastian's videos. Was it in Veto? You said there, Roger, that one.
What's that?
Vevolution.
Vevolution. The Vevolution one. Yeah. That's that one in particular I find really, really enlightening about this topic, definitely. So I think I definitely recommend.
Well, and when we talked about the little tie on the kind of necktie, we've obviously, I think we've tied this show up fairly neatly in that sense, because we came back to the topic at the end, which is pretty good. Oh, I tell you one thing I wanted to say. When Pattrice was talking about the story that Carol Adams often says, the thing about the English beef eaters going around, kind of, the vanquishers of the vegetarians and everything. I was in the north of England during the miners' strike in Britain, which was, I think, 1984. And there was a charity match between vegans and the miners to raise money for them. And the press, using that very same construction, they called it the beefies versus the beanies. And there was a suggestion that the vegans were going to get absolutely hammered by the meat eaters, And I always said that, well, it didn't work out that way because we won 2-1. But I was actually speaking to somebody who was at the game about 3 weeks ago, and apparently we won 3-1. So it didn't quite work out. But the construction was there, that very thing, which is really interesting.
Oh, that is interesting. Still going on.
Yeah, beefies and beanies. Right, folks, anybody got anything else to say, or should we just wave and say goodbye?
Yes, I would like to ask Pattrice to say a little about In Context, which is a new podcast series or video series. Really interesting discussion, and I think Sebastian was a guest in one episode. So I think this is a brilliant thing, and I would love if you could tell something about it.
Oh, thank you so much, because I'm supposed to remember myself and Vine, and I hardly ever do. So, In Context with Pattrice Jones is a half-hour show that is released on Unchained TV. The videos are released on YouTube, and it also exists as an audio podcast released on all of your favorite podcasting platforms. And the show, smash a like on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube right now, go to Vine Sanctuary on YouTube and hit the subscribe to In Context, and you'll hear conversations between me and amazing, fabulous activists like Christopher Sebastian, Brenda Sanders, artists like Louder Than Words, writers, anybody who's doing really innovative work, thinking through the kinds of things we've been talking about here, are guests on In Context. So please do smash that subscribe button. And remember that if you are feeling awkward or uncomfortable about the prospect of trying to be actively anti-racist, you will mess up, but that's okay, because you're human and humans make mistakes. Like, that should be our defining feature. Instead of Homo sapien, it should be like Homo erroneous. And well,
I was a mistake. Apparently, I was like 10 years after everybody else.
And and you can tolerate it. You can tolerate the making of mistakes. You can tolerate learning things that you didn't know yet. You can tolerate learning that things you believed were not true. You can tolerate discovering that you have accidentally been participating in, or at least benefiting from, injurious structures and that hurt others. And you can live with knowing that you won't be able to fix it right away, but still committing to actually just doing something. Like all of that is possible. And if you're vegan, you've already proved that it's possible for you to do that, because you do it with regard to animals. And there isn't any reason at all you can't also do it with regard to social injustices of any kind, including racism.
Well said. And I just wanted to say thank you to Pattrice and Sebastian for all the work that you do, because I find sometimes I feel lost with some of this stuff, and it's just really soothing to me, and I feel really grateful that I have the likes of you and your bodies of work, your videos, your writings, your essays, your books to refer to and to learn from, and to improve my own activism and to improve myself as a human being on the planet. So I'm really, really grateful to both of you and your work. So many thanks.
We love y'all too.
Thank you.
It's a loving. So people, thanks for sticking with us, and we shall see you. In fact, we've got a show coming up fairly soon, haven't we, Wendy? Oh, look out.
Here's Dylan. He's popped in to say hello.
It's the Dylan show.
The giant of the house. Yes, next week we have another show, don't we? We
do. Yeah. So we're breaking our once a month rule already. So there you go. Right, people. Thanks again, and bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.